What is going on, guys? My name is Warren Sturry. I'm a member of the Nashville Valley Scottish Rite here in Nashville, Tennessee. Today we have a very interesting presentation from 32nd degree Scottish Rite Mason, Tennessee Mason, Karak Arnett. Karak is a good friend of mine. Anytime I have a conversation with this guy, I always learn something new. And to have him here sharing this knowledge with us is truly a blessing. This is what every valley and every lodge should be doing in masonry, is hosting things like this. And we take great pride in the content that we produce here in the Nashville Valley because we believe the fruit to be what the point of the labor is. You know, we come and we work as masons and we provide things for us to look back at and to learn from. So, Karak, you know, I don't want to talk for too long because I'm just going to make myself look stupid at some point, man. So I'm going to go ahead and
that's an impossibility.
I'm going to pass the mic. I'm going to pass the mic to Karak. I'm going to make him the host, and he's going to go ahead and take us on a very interesting alchemical journey through history and through masonry. So, Karak, brother, it's all you, man.
I appreciate the send-off, Warren. Just to give you a little bit of a background on this particular subject, I've always been interested in alchemy. As a few of you know, my family were, high-ranking Freemasons and Rosicrucians through hundreds of years. So I've got a lot of documentation and fun little things that I've, kind of stumbled across the way over a long period of time. I wrote a play. Oh, wow. Feels like an ages ago. But I wrote a play based on some of my research in Bali, Thailand, China, and India, and Australia, related to the idea of man as the physical element of alchemy, and taking the idea of the philosophical concept of alchemy, specifically related to man being the laboratory himself. And the play was based on the 7 candlesticks or the 7 chakras, depending on what school of thought you believe in. And in that process of writing the play, I wrote it in pulp. And the scene right before I wrote the scene on alchemy, I had referenced a bunch of alchemical terms. And at the time, sometimes when you write, you feel you're guided. I didn't know what I was doing. I was like, for some reason, alchemy needs to go here, so I'm just throwing it in. And then the next scene I wrote, in my research, I discovered what I'm going to be talking about today, which is up until that time, I had believed specifically that alchemy was only a philosophical, kind of spiritual science from ages past. And what I discovered is that maybe there was actually a physical component to it. So let's see here. Basically, what we're going to be talking today is the Philosopher's Stone and the 3 great lights of alchemy. A good friend of, a fast good friend of ours, P.D. Newman, just put a book out called Angels of Vermilion. I'm a big advocate, especially after he gave his talk in Nashville a few weeks back, on his idea of the stone of projection, which I believe is lapidum vegetalis. The alchemist talked about lapidum vegetalis, which lapidum means stone. Just FYI, just in case we're so, for example, lapis lazuli would be blue stone. So lapidum vegetalis, being the stone or the mineral or the substance, it comes from the vegetable matter that helps the alchemist in his journey. But there's also something called the white stone, which I believe is lapidum mineralis. And that's what I'm actually going to be talking about today, is that white stone. And then finally, there's a third stone called lapidum animalis. And if you have done any research into some of the properties of some of the interesting things, alchemists had a lot of frog iconography. There are some interesting frogs that generate a form of a compound that makes you basically experience oneness. People talk about the idea of unity and that kind of thing as part of the process. I believe all 3 of these things were created or found through the process of alchemy. And so we'll be talking about, obviously, the lapidum mineralis is our main focus. And so let me make sure I'm hitting my slides here. I apologize, guys. 1 second. Okay. So Warren, while I figure this out really quick, if you want to go ahead and talk about P.D. Newman's talk, that'd be cool, just because I don't want there to be any dead air.
Of course.
And I'll be
Yeah,
quick
so
about my process here.
If y'all haven't had the opportunity to look into Brother P.D. Newman, so he is a Mason out of Tupelo, Mississippi. And he wrote his first book. I'll finish this note and then hand it back to you, Karak. He finished his first book a couple years ago. It was called Alchemically Stoned: The Psychedelic Secret of Freemasonry, which is interesting. And then he released his second book just recently, and that book is called Angels in Vermilion: The Philosopher's Stone from D to DMT. And essentially the summary of his work, and I would recommend that you guys order these books if this interests you.
Phenomenal work.
Yeah, any way, shape, or form. The summary of his work is essentially people throughout time have been digging into nature and pulling out certain plants and chemicals and ingesting these things through various methods to have spiritual experiences. And the frequency of that throughout time is pretty much what Brother Newman talks about in those books. You guys should definitely check them out. Karak, I'm gonna pass the mic back to you, man. It looks like you got your slides working.
Perfect.
Yeah, P.D. Newman,
you.
and we'll go ahead and say something about him at the end of this as well, and link his work too.
Yeah, I can't speak highly enough about this particular brother. He's done a lot of research. He's incredibly academic. The man is just an amazing, academician. And honestly, I believe, based on my studies of alchemy, I believe he's onto something, because the alchemists always talked about how it was a procession of processes. And in that DMT process, to paraphrase Cagliostro, can you hear me? Did I go on mute?
Nope, I hear you.
Okay, good. Okay, great. So to paraphrase Cagliostro, he would administer the red stone, the stone of projection, so that the initiate could understand the rest of the lecture and the rest of the initiation, the symbolism. According to the alchemists, that was the first process. The second process was the lapis mineralis. And in 1956, a Salt Lake City man basically discovered a form of a white stone. This was in Sweden when he was 19, that apparently started the process of what I like to say is proving alchemy. So with that said, I'll go to my next slide here. So this is the circumpunct. It's an ancient symbol. It can be used to represent the solar deity. It can represent solar mass in astronomy. The sun. In alchemy, it represents gold. It also represents Ra. And in mathematics, it represents the point within a plane. So gold is the most electrically conductive element, along with silver. However, silver isn't as stable as gold is. So from that perspective, not only can gold conduct the electricity, but it also is the most stable, thereby making it the most electrically conductive. It can also handle heat. And it will not corrode unless high degrees. Now, it will be soluble in mercury, interestingly enough. The alchemists talked about that. It's the most non-reactive of all metals and is benign in all natural industrial environments. It never reacts with oxygen, which is where we get rust, including oxidation in the body. Gold tarnish is very thin and shows up as darkening or reflecting surfaces. So the alchemists talked about that. They said that the gold was the most stable element. They called it the sun metal. We'll get back into all that. But it's important to kind of understand a few basic terms related to alchemy. And for a lot of this might be kindergarten 101 for you guys, but I'm going to go through it anyway. And so okay, let me know when you guys can see my next slide here. For some reason, I'm having trouble with my slides. Warren, is that showing up as next slide?
I'm ready to sue Microsoft PowerPoint at this point. These people are messing around with it. No, this is still on the same slide, from what I can see.
Understood. Yeah. Apologies. Okay. So here we have a perfect representation. This is in 1669. It's an engraving called Actorum Laboratory Chemici, right? And essentially, you can see the AER represents the air or ether element, the aqua, and then the terra are the three elements. But also, you can see right here, Vegetalis. So that's the lapidum vegetalis. You've got the animalis, which is the lapidum animalis, and then you've got the lapidum mineralis. And if you look, and I don't know how much detail you guys can see here, but if you look really closely, you have all of these metals, but at the very top here, you've got the gold or the sun at the very top. And part of that is to show that these were all the metals that you had to kind of go through to get to the purification of that pure gold. And so, again, you'll see this common in alchemy, but they also talk about the salt, sulfur, and mercury as these three different natures, interestingly enough. So here we have a front piece from Kircher called the Magna Lucis El Umbre. Now, interestingly enough, this is 1646, and you can clearly see that there are two different types of rays. The first type of ray is a solar ray that is creating what we would know as the normal spectrum, what Newton talks about as the normal spectrum, which is this red, blue, and gold, or I'm sorry, red, blue, and green, RGB. However, you can see that there's another spectrum, interestingly enough, that is talked about here. It's the lunar spectrum, and that lunar spectrum also produces its own set of rays. Now, interestingly enough, Johann von Goethe, who also happened to be a Freemason and had his own series of color theory, found out about Newton's experiments and decided to do his own experiments. The difference is that instead of just using what's called a atlas obscura, where you use a cave and you split a beam of light, he actually used both a black and white surface, quite by accident. And in the process, he actually discovered a completely different color spectrum. Now, this is really important because the alchemists constantly talked about different rays and sensitivities of rays and how these rays would affect different compositions of different metals. And so, essentially, because Newton used only the black or the shadow or the camera obscura, as you can see in this cave, the colors were only shown as this. Now, interestingly enough, in our black and white mosaic pavement in our lodges, you have the same, concept of dualism. Now, I would submit that not only is the alchemist pointing to the fact that there are subtler rays, that the moon has its own set of rays or spectrum, but that these rays are really important for the alchemical work. And as you can see, you've got the double-headed eagle on this side with the solar rays, and you've got the two, specifically the two peacocks on this side, representing the other kind of color spectrum that you're going to get. The other interesting thing is that the sun here in this image on the right-hand side, and then the star body or lunar body on the other side represent two different points of duality, right? However, what's interesting is that the sun is a star, and for those of you who always hear me talk about this, I'll reiterate again. So when you're looking at the solar body here, what you're really looking at is kind of the inverse of what the sun really is, right? Essentially that every one of these stars are really solar in nature. And that was really important to the alchemists. There we go. Now we're working with gasoline. So vitriol was a common term in alchemy. Now vitriol is actually a form of acidic compound that is a powerful acid that can dissolve human tissue, and it's corrosive to all metals except gold. However, the alchemists also used it as an acronym for the Latin Visitia Interia Terra Refectionato Invius Occultum Lapidum, which translates roughly to visit the interior of the earth, and by rectifying what you find there, you will discover the hidden stone. So it's a really important to understand in alchemy that the processes that they talked about, they never were saying that from nothing they were creating gold, because it's impossible. You have to have somewhat of a substance, right? So you usually have that transformative powder, which they talked about as the red or white or sometimes black powder. that they used. If you take this literally, if there is as the alchemists talk about, a seed to plants, a seed to metals, and a seed to animals, that seed of the mineral could be used in order to grow or accelerate the process. And that's what alchemists were really doing. They were accelerating the process within nature itself so that it could speed up the process that would naturally happen in, let's say, 100 years. They were trying to accelerate it in, let's say, 40 days. So basically, the 7-letter acronym vitriol is an actual form of sulfuric acid. It's considered a core medium of alteration and seen as a symbolic secret fire that guides us towards spiritual excellence. Now, I truly believe that there was a philosophical component to this, because it was said that there were different grades of alchemists, and certain alchemists or hermeticists were practicing a philosophical place in order to purify themselves, their mind, their emotions, their body, to be able to do these things. I don't think that growing gold or transmuting lead into gold was the ultimate aspect of alchemy. I think it was an aspect of a greater workbook, so to speak, that was teaching them basic major principles within the universe and in cosmic laws. With that said, where does alchemy come from? So the Oxford Dictionary defines it as the medieval forerunner of chemistry, based on the supposed transformation of matter. It was concerned particularly with attempts to convert base metals, like lead, into gold, or to find a universal elixir. Occult sciences such as alchemy and astrology are somehow also correlated. It's also called the black arts, and we'll get to that in a minute because that's actually really important. But similar to that, chemistry, magic, sorcery, witchcraft, and enchantment. Now, witchcraft's initial etymological root is actually from wish. So you're going to start seeing kind of some correlations to what we're talking about related to alchemy and some of these other concepts. So the origin, supposedly from Oxford, is Old French and Medieval Latin, from Arabic, alchemia, from al, the, and chemia, which they don't go into translation of, which I think is hilarious. From Greek, it says chemia, art of transmuting metals. However, a number of names were used for Egypt in ancient times. So a popular name for Egypt was Kem, or Kemet, which means the black land. So when we're talking about the black arts, we're also talking about the black land. So really, alchemy is the lessons from Egypt, right? Like literally that's where it comes from. And basically, scholars generally believe that this name derives from the fertile soils left over when the Nile floods or recedes in August. I would go a step further and say that there were a lot of hidden sciences that Egypt had. We know that they were masters of embalming. We know that they had used some crazy intense information related to what we now understand as electrical theory when it comes to the Great Pyramid. There are 3 different types of granite in the Great Pyramid, and when you combine them, it actually makes the same version as basically an electrical wire today. The original Great Pyramid was completely white on the outside and had a red and black granite exterior, and that red granite was known as a firestone and was actually slightly radioactive. So when you had all 3 together, it created this intense electrical conductivity within the Great Pyramid itself. So I would submit that there's more going on there for sure. But to that point, alchemy comes from the lands of Egypt. So interestingly enough, this actually dates back supposedly to the realm of Moses. So alchemy will talk about the staff with the serpent, which directly corresponds to the biblical verse within Moses where Aaron throws his rod on the ground and it turns into a bunch of serpents. And then the same thing happens with the priests of Egypt. Now, whether or not that's allegorical or not, what you need to know about Moses is that he was an adept of Egypt. He was a royal prince of Egypt, and all royalty within the Egyptian royal houses, they learned all the supposed magic or science within Egypt. So when he left with all of the the Jewish people and all of that, and left the Pharaoh. He went into the desert and he went up to Mount Sinai. And if you're a big fan of Mel Brooks, he came back down with 15 tablets and saw that they were worshiping a calf. And that may have astrological correspondences to Taurus. and then going into the age of Aries is what I've heard some rumors on that. But whether or not that's the truth, it does say biblically he threw the tablets down and went back up the mountain and then got the basic don't kill, don't lie, don't steal, etc. Although those can be, I could give a whole talk on that because those can be quite complex too when you actually break down some of the symbolism of those 10 commandments. But the Kabbalah, which is literally translated as oral tradition or from mouth to ear, was a tradition that Moses passed on to the tribe of Levi, who were the priesthood class of the 12 tribes of Israel and of Aaron. And the Kabbalah talks about some very intense principles. I am under the deep impression, based on my research through Chem and also through the Kabbalah, that the Chaldaic Egyptian science that may hail from antediluvian times descended from the Kabbalah, and that Moses taught the Kabbalah because this was basically like a really high form of quantum physics science, kind of the stuff that we're getting into now. So the Kabbalah actually plays pretty heavily in alchemy. Here is our friend, could be Moses, could be Hermes Trismegistus. It's supposed to be Hermes Trismegistus, according to J. Knapp, who was the artist who did this. This is from the Mysterious Cities of Gold. That is a Freudian slip. That's a great cartoon, by the way, from the 80s. If you haven't checked it out, it's super obscure and rare, but check it out for sure. This is from The Secret Teachings of All Ages by Manly P. Hall. And if you look at, you see that he is holding a caduceus with a white and black serpent, which we talk about as the Kundalini force or the life force within the body. But it can also be seen as electricity and magnetism, the two opposing forces at 90-degree angles. The neutral force being in the middle. It can also be seen as the Kabbalah. It can be seen as a tree of life because you've got the middle pillar and then the two pillars on the side there. But Hermes Trismegistus was supposedly a representation of Thoth, who was also a representation of Mercury. So you'll see that same imaging within Thoth. You see the ibis here, and you'll see that in the same image within Mercury, the same winged disc and the same staff, what they call the staff of Hermes. So he was supposedly the founder of alchemy, and specifically Thoth was, rumor had it, the son of a official within if you believe in that antediluvian principle, the Atlantean governing. He was basically governor in Atlantis, and Thoth was directly descended from him, and that's the rumor, at least that's been talked about in the Chemite societies in Egypt. So here again we have Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice great, on the right-hand side as you're looking at it. If you notice, you have a body here, and the body is actually, if you look really closely, that's also Hermes Trismegistus. So the story here is essentially you're looking at his physical self, and he's asleep or is in a deep state of meditation, and his greater self, or what's known as the astral body, astral meaning star, and we'll get back to that, or soul or solar body, that is wandering about and is learning the secrets of the universe, so to speak, and is transmitting those things. That same tradition is in Egypt. That same tradition is talked about. This is on your left-hand side. You've got the Ka or Ba, the spirit, wandering outside of the body. That winged individual is the winged pharaoh, and he's traveling. And the tradition is that the initiates of their last great initiation, supposedly the Great Pyramid, they would leave their body for 3 days and basically learn the secrets of nature and come back and be adepts and initiate others. Now, interestingly enough, as my good friend P.D. Newman would talk about, the Greeks, all the Greek, Pythagoras, Plato, Aristotle, all those guys ended up going to Egypt at some point, petitioning for Egypt, studying in Egypt, and then coming back and establishing their schools. So if you start doing the math, it becomes very interesting, the influence on that particular society with the rest of the Western world. So surrounding the base of steps of the needle were fragments of a black and white mosaic pavement, specifically the needle of Cleopatra. So what you're looking at is actually the needle of Cleopatra in New York, and this was There's another needle of Cleopatra that's in London. I'll let you look up needle of Cleopatra, or if anyone has any kind of interest in it, we can talk about it after if you have any questions on it. But there are two needles of Cleopatra, one in New York and one in London. The one in New York is in Central Park. And surrounding the base of the steps of this needle, when they found it in, I believe, Heliopolis, were fragments of a black and white mosaic pavement. So this excited the team's suspicion, and despite the plan to retrieve the obelisk alone, they decided to unearth the entire pedestal. So this was buried underneath of the obelisk when they were transporting it to New York and to London, respectively. Most of the steps of the pedestal are of gray limestone, with 4 exceptions. 3 pieces of syenite, 3 syenite pieces. One is perfectly polished cube. Another is hewn in the shape of a builder's square. The third is a rough-hewn stone. However, the grooves found in the stone seem intentional, and an odd choice for pedestal foundation. The perfectly polished cube was found in the northeast corner of the pedestal. Those with familiarity of our traditions are probably as intrigued as Gorge was, who was also a brother. By this discovery, and his team were nearly 150 years ago, another brick made of limestone was found at the house of trowel, and another a lead plummet, a plum, firmly cemented into the stone. Among other oddities found placed at the foundation were clean pieces of limestone, each with markings: a chevron-style mason's mark, a curved line that might represent a snake, 3 parallel lines, and a carving of 1/4 of an arc of a circle. The foundation was removed in pieces and cataloged in shape, size, and placement, and a number so it could be dutifully reassembled. The striking similarity between the forms and actual and relative positions of the pieces and the emblems of what appeared to be Freemasonry led to the appointment of a committee of Freemasons by the Grand Lodge of Egypt to examine them. And after discussion and deliberation, the following conclusions were announced. The polished cube found on the east corresponds with the perfect ashlar. The polished square with the builder's square, the rough black found in the west corner, the rough ashlar. The stone with the snakes, emblematic of wisdom. The axis stone, the trestle board, and the marked chevron, the master's mark. The polished white cube on an emblem of purity, and the 18 pieces forming the lower steps designate what appears to be the word of our 18th degree of Scottish Rite. So, as you can probably tell, I'm more of a Romantic Mason and less of a modern. But as you can see here in an alchemical manuscript dated in 1820, there are some interesting correlations to the 7 candlesticks, to Grecian and Roman, but also Egyptian heritage, and also to the square and compasses. So I'll leave that there. Now, in modern times, the story of Atlantis has attracted numerous literature. Much of it is highly speculative in nature. The element of a mystery which will still persists. And so basically, Atlantis was an island which enshrined human ideals, supposedly super highly advanced. And a lot of people think that Plato invented it. But actually, if you look at the background and to Egyptian etymology, it's actually legitimized by Plato's account of the origin of the story in his Timaeus. He tells us that the earliest Greek source was the Athenian statesman Solon, who happened to be a relative of his. And that Solon, who heard the story during his travels in Egypt, it was very old, and a very old priest in the city of Sais related to him. When Solon arrived at the city, he's told that in a much honored tradition, they were very friendly to the Athenians. He also states that the saints worshipped the goddess Nith, whom they equated with Athena. And it was in both Greek and Egyptian traditions. And the comparison that follows, 1,000 years ago, Egyptian civilization is said to have begun 1,000 years later. He's saying that at one point, Athens, or also known as Poseid, was a city that the Atlanteans had attacked, and then the Egyptian civilization had been started 1,000 years after that. But Atlantis was actually spoken to Plato by his descendant, and Plato eventually went to Atlantis and to Egypt, Freudian slip, and learned that information for himself. Now, the pyramid structures from around the world, you've got Ziggurat of Ur, Pyramid of Khufu, Pyramid of Zoser, Ziggurat of Tepe Salak, Tomb of King Kashta, Pyramid of the Sun, Tomb of the General, El Castillo. I mean, literally all the way around the world, there's these pyramid structures, as we're finding out as we're becoming more of a global society and growing. What I will say is one of the famous ones that's just been uncovered recently is called Göbekli Tepe, and that actually has an older name that is I can't remember the actual verbiage, but it translates to Osiris's navel. So pretty fascinating, the whole thing, to be quite honest, relating to that particular tradition. Now, with that said, I've given you a little clue here as to where we're going. I believe that these societies were holding this ancient knowledge from a greater antediluvian society, because there is science that we are now just uncovering that the alchemists used as a core dogma or principle, if you will, and they were adamant about it. And we're just discovering that information now in modern science. So we'll get to that in a minute. So here you have the Mysterium Magnum Studium Universalis. This is actually from a book that that was passed down to me. It's a super rare manuscript called the Codex Rosicrucis. And my great-grandmother had it in her collection, which is amazing. It's from the German from the 1600s. Manly P. Hall did a rework of it, I believe, in the early 30s, I want to say. And that book is also super rare. You can get a photocopy of it. I recommend it highly. It's really encoded. A lot of it is Kabbalah. But some of the principles are interesting. Some of the words right off the bat you can see. For example, you can see the word tincture. You can see that there's a golden tincture or solar and a lunar tincture as well. And I would submit that they were dealing with the three aspects of philosophy, like I talked about, which is the more philosophical, emotional, mental side of alchemy, which is totally real, the spiritual side of alchemy, and then the physical, actual side of alchemy of transmuting base metals into gold, or into other metals, I should say. So with that said, we'll go to the next slide. And that is this series of alchemical woodcuts. So the first one I want to point out is, and I know Brother Midge Denning is on here, so he'll appreciate this, the rebus. Except this particular rebus is from 1629. And this rebus has all the same, it's got a compass, a square, all the different elements. You can see the vegetative world here, and then there's a greater light. Now, interestingly enough, if you correlate it exactly, the greater light is coming from the generative area of the body, which is probably not an accident, to be quite honest. But it's illumined, and it's a plant light that's illumined. And the alchemists talked about that. They talked about the astral light. Also, the Kabbalists talked about that as well. Again, astral means star. So the star or celestial light that's coming off of objects. And we know that today is the electromagnetic field. And for my brothers in Nashville, I hope to do some experiments with you to show you some really interesting things that happen when you take an aux cord and actually show frequency coming off of plants and yourself, etc. So there are frequencies coming off of everything. And the alchemists knew that inherently. The other thing that you'll see is that the second slide here, you've got this dark, dragon. So here we have the same concept of a lunar force and a solar force. And I would say that these forces are real forces that the alchemists knew about. Again, subtler than what our instrumentation has been able to measure so far, but not so much. We'll get into that. There's some interesting correlation that's proving that some of this stuff was really real. The last thing is you'll see the alchemist in a sense of supplication or prayer. That's on the very right-hand side. And this particular one is Mirror of the Rosicrucian Wisdom. So the alchemists always had to start with supplication, always had to start with the opening of prayer. Now, there is some interesting science that we can go into, and we will a little bit later behind that. But the alchemists understood that their thoughts and feelings actually affected, quote unquote, the experiment or their laboratory, and that they would get greater results when they were pure of heart, pure of intention, pure of mind. And I would almost say that going back to Brother P.D. Newman's work, that the alchemists had to be purified to a certain level with the lapidum vegetalis in order to even get to the state where they could start to purify to get to these other greater works. So the Philosopher's Stone, alchemical traditions, whether European, Middle Eastern, or Asian, pursue the same prize, the creation of the Philosopher's Stone, aka the pearl of great price, as in it talked about in the Orient, the wish-fulfilling jewel, that was what was talked about in the Occident or the Persian Empire, and the heart of the sun, which is more of the European style of alchemy. The tool that turns base lead into gold. Now, the base lead could be the soul. The base lead could be your consciousness, or the base lead could literally be lead into gold. I ascertained that all three of those things were happening simultaneously. So Hermes Trismegistus, one thing becomes the materia prima, or first matter, the source of all existence. Aristotle described it as the invisible force that contains all the universe. From the materia prima came the elements, fire, air, water, and earth, and the fundamental constituents of life. The elements are utilized in the classic 7 steps for producing the stone, and they are calcination, which is reducing a substance to ashes, or purification by fire; dissolution, dissolving ash into a liquid, or purification by water; separation, filtering and separating the products of dissolution, purification by air; conjunction, recombining into a new substance, purification by earth; fermentation, breaking down the substance by decomposition; distillation, boiling and condensing, producing a more refined substance, as in making wine or spirits; and then finally, coagulation, or manifestation, the final step. The substance is transmuted into a crystalline or solid state, resulting in one of the stones, in this case, the Philosopher's Stone. This process, referred to as the magnum opus of the great work by alchemists, requires ear-whispered instruction by a master. Again, mouth to ear. Text alone leads seekers down blind alleys and dead ends after years of work. The true solution or ultimate insight to be discovered by the wise is that the alchemical process is an allegory for spiritual development, inescapable psychological steps through which each individual must pass to reach realization. It is the ultimate transmutation, turning the base lead and ego to gold or enlightenment, via steps of destruction and refinement. To the master, producing physical gold is the inferior result. Transmuting and refining the soul is the true prize. Now, interestingly enough, if you notice how this is worded, it doesn't say that it's not possible. To the master, producing physical gold is the inferior result. That means that this is like I said, it's like a lesson. Like, yeah, this is what matter does, and this is a step in the process of understanding how to basically, handle your as above, so below. So, quantum mechanics is the best theory we have for describing the world at the nuts and bolts level of atoms and subatomic particles. So, one of the interesting outcomes of a quantum experiment is that you can change depending on whether or not we choose to measure some property of the particles involved. So, when the observer effect was first noticed by the early pioneers of quantum theory, they were deeply troubled. And if you want to look at quantum levels, what you're looking at is like really, really, really small pieces of matter and their interaction with the material plane. So basically, when we would observe the particle, it would be a particle. But the minute we looked away, it was a wave. This is actually called the Slit experiment, and the double slit experiment. And essentially, it proved that the observer has an effect. Now, my submission to you is, how do the alchemists know that? Because they already knew that hundreds of years ago. And you're looking at alchemy in a new light, of course, but initially, as we've been told, probably growing up, and maybe even before this talk is, it's a bunch of charlatans, and they're counterfeiters, and there was that happening for sure. There are people that weren't pure, that tried to do quick steps and everything else, but that wasn't all that was going on in my humble opinion. So some of the researchers felt forced to conclude that objectivity was an illusion and that consciousness had to be allowed an active role in quantum theory. And others, that did not make sense. Surely Albert Einstein once complained, the moon does not exist only when we look at it. Well, interestingly enough, Albert Einstein has actually been recorded as, first of all, being a brother, and secondly, studying alchemical manuscripts during the time when he was making E equals mc squared. E equals mc squared being the theory of energy equals matter times the speed of light. Basically, that all pieces of matter are vibrating at such a rapid rate that if you were able to step it up, that rate would cause an explosion, meaning that all matter is radiative, or that all matter is really frozen light, or is light or energy. So that's alchemy. That's essentially what alchemy says. So I would say Albert Einstein started to, at the end of his career, and you can look at some of his languaging, really kind of watch himself, because he saw what E equals mc squared did. He was dealing with unified theory, and there are a lot of there's a lot of kind of rumor at the old mill, so to speak, that he did actually understand unified theory and then realize the implications of what it would do in the wrong hands. And since E equals mc squared had gone in the wrong hands, the rest is history. So this is the main alchemy principle based on the Hermetic philosophy of the Emerald Tablet. And this is actually the version that Newton had Isaac Newton had translated. But there are Arabic versions that are older. So this is kind of a synopsis of it. "'Tis true without lying, certain and most true. That which is below is like that which is above, and that which is above is like that which is below, to do the miracle of the one thing. And as all things have been and arose from one, by the mediation of one, so all things have their birth from this one thing by adaptation. The sun is its father, the moon its mother. The wind hath carried in its belly, the earth is its nurse." So there you have the four elements. But on top of that, you have ether. You have the binding force. And I would submit that if this is coming from an ancient science that they already understood, that we're basically finding out that's exactly what happened. The Big Bang, astrophysics, the Kabbalah talks about the great emanation. All these things talk about the same idea of this emanating force, this one unified substance that basically makes all material form you're looking at, and through the crucible of what we know today as solar or the stars. And that's what's said of in the Emerald Tablet. So again, some interesting correlation here. The force or power of it is entire if it can be converted into earth. That means if it's converted into material form, if you can manifest it. Separate thou the earth from the fire. So you could take this to mean the material realm from the spiritual realm, as the alchemists would say, but also the earth from the fire, meaning that there's going to be a part of the metal or material you're using that is of a denser nature, and there's going to be a part of that material that is of a liquid nature and of a even more volatile nature, like a gaseous nature or a plasma nature, as we know that to be the case. So the subtle from the gross, or the dross. So that's exactly what happens when we refine metals, right? We take the really refined stuff, we put it to the side, and we separate the stuff that's slag. If you're a fan of the show Forged by Fire or whatever it is, where he's like, it will cut. That's the principle behind it, right? Is that they're purifying those metals. Same thing with alchemy. Sweetly with great industry, it ascends from the earth to the heaven, and again it descends from the earth, and receives the force of things superior and inferior. So this is talking about cycles within our psychology, within our spiritual awareness, within our consciousness, but also within a test tube that they may have been literally, transmuting into precious metals. For it vanquishes every subtle thing and penetrates every solid thing. So is the world created. From this are and do come admirable adaptations, where the means of is here. Hence I am called Hermes Trismegistus, having the three parts of philosophy of the whole world. That which I have said of the operation of the sun is accomplished and ended. Now the sun can be solar, meaning the soul. The sun can mean operation of the sun, as in what I just showed you earlier, the circumpunct, i.e. gold. So these things are interchangeable, in my opinion. So back in the early 2011 timeframe, Moby created a great little tune called "We're All Made of Stars." And it's actually inspired by the scientific principle that all matter in the universe is essentially made up of stardust. So again, alchemists knew this. And how? How did they know this? And again, initially, we thought that it was just certain elements and the others. However, it's also possible some of our hydrogen and lithium, a very tiny trace, originated from the Big Bang, from the initial emanation. So why do the stars shine? What messages can we read in the light? Well, nuclear astrophysics is a fascinating discipline and enables connections to be made between atoms, stars, and human beings. Though modern astronomy scientists have managed to unravel the full history of the chemical elements, understand how they originated and evolved in all the elements that compose our surroundings today. The transformation of metals into gold, something once dreamed of by alchemists, is a process commonly occurring in the cores of massive stars. But the most exciting revelation is the infinite connection that humanity has with the debris of exploded stars. Stellar alchemy is an engaging account of nucleosynthesis in stars and the associated chemical evolution of the universe that is suitable for the general reader. Stellar Alchemy is a great book, by the way. It puts some better, more concrete principles into this whole process. But I am going to rewind and talk about Egypt for a second. The ideas behind Egypt, their creation myth was the myth of Aten. And Aten was a mouth, so a Vesica Pisces, that was speaking through its stellar and I'm hoping not to gross anybody out, but stellar sperm, and it created worlds, and then the Great Sea knew it, and was impregnated by those worlds, etc. Well, that's what modern astrophysics says about how actually galaxies are created. Sonic boom patterns create a twist in space-time. From that sonic boom or sound, material form starts twisting to form, and light, thereby creating matter. So again, the Egyptians seem to have a pretty good idea about what's actually happening within our realm of astrophysics. So stars that go supernova are responsible for creating many of the elements of the periodic table, including all those that make up the human body. Planetary scientist and stardust expert Dr. Ashley King explains it's totally 100% true. Nearly all the elements of the human body were made in a star, and many have come through several supernovas. Now, interestingly enough, every single element in the periodic table, every element in the universe is also within us. And that may be why the ancients said man is the measurement of all things, because we literally have, by proportion, uranium might be like on the craziest smallest level possible, but it's there within our bodies. And it's the balance of those things, and the alchemists understood this. It's the balance of those things that creates health and healing. And one of the ideas behind the secrets of alchemy is that there was a process. Take it easy, Brad. There was a process of transmutation where you were balancing your body, and so therefore you could heal maybe ailments and things like that with these tinctures made from the alchemical process. So many still believe that the material and mental world are separate. We can certainly agree that the material world influences our thought, but how can our thinking influence material reality? It begins with Rene Descartes. It was a French mathematician and philosopher of the 17th century who started the mechanistic vision of the universe where matter is governed by mathematical and predictable laws. So these theories have influenced key concepts in the various scientific disciplines up to present day. Descartes found himself in trouble when he was unable to apply his mechanical theory to human thought because the variables in the functioning of the mind are too many to be subject to laws. So basically he created a philosophical system in which mind and matter did not belong to the same method of observation and investigation, separating the research aspects of their functioning for centuries. However, Descartes appears to have been an alchemist and was fascinated by the pineal gland, as he believed it as the seat of the soul. Newton also appeared to be an alchemist, although I would say he no longer appeared to be an alchemist. He was an alchemist, it's been proven, although a closet alchemist. And these guys seem to have learned more than they let on, so to speak, and we're kind of hiding it from the general public. So again, sometimes light behaves like a wave, and sometimes it behaves like a particle. And we know that there is a mental reaction with matter. So the alchemists talked about the 5 levels of matter. They talked about a fire or tetrahedron. This is the simplest of the elements, also the processing element or the elements of change. And the first, the astrological new year, the heat of fire. But also the tetrahedron was called pyramid or fire in the middle. Pyramid, fire in the middle. So interestingly enough, tetrahedron is probably the most common shape at a molecular level or a subatomic level that you'll see in matter. All of these elements were said to have made up matter, and we now know with modern science the combination of these 5 or their combination of 13, what's now known as the Archimedean solids, do make up at a microscopic level everything that we know as matter today. And again, the alchemists knew this. So interestingly enough, they also corresponded to the tree of life. They talked about the Asaluth being the fire element, the Bria being the air element, the Yesera being the water element, and then Saya, the active world, being the earth element. But the entire tree of life, the ladder of Jacob, being the etheric element. So you can break this down into physical body, the mental body or the world of thought, the world of emotion, and then finally the spiritual or the archetypal or the blueprint of these 4 worlds, right? Again, as above, so below. So the alchemists used chemical methods to try to make gold from lead. They were searching for the Philosopher's Stone, that magic stuff to make valuable gold from a much more abundant and less useful metal, lead. They were really never successful, but modern nuclear chemistry and physics has been able to achieve this change. By colliding neutrons with lead atoms, the neutron knocks off protons to form a gold atom. Where do we get these neutrons? From a particle accelerator that speeds up neutrons and gives them more energy when they collide with an atom. There's only one problem. The process costs more to run than the value of the gold forms. So it can be done, but you'll go broke in the process. However, I would believe that if it can be done, and we've now proven it can be done in laboratories, that the fact that they said it could be done should give you pause. And I think it's hilarious and a little bit of a hubris that they were never really successful, because there were lots of alchemists who have literally filled the coffers of kings. And, you know, again, you may say that they're really good counterfeiters. Maybe, but there was a lot of them. And so here we have the four worlds in the body. What's known as the atom katamon, the tetragrammaton of God as the body of man, but also the mother and father energies, or moon and sun energies, or lunar and solar energies, creating the final philosopher's stone, as you can see here, the salt, sulfur, and mercury. Now, the pillar of Boaz is the element of water, and the pyramid, the pillar of Jachin, is the element of fire. And again, interesting enough, what do we have in the lunar currents? Well, the tides, the water, right? I'm part Native American. We talk about lunar ceremony. You know, the time when the moon or the emotions are at a height, both for men and women. Actually, that's been proven. And the same thing with the solar radiation, right? The fire element. Now, interestingly enough, fire in its very nature. So when you light a candle, or next time you have a bonfire, you're hanging out with your friends, or if you're a smoker, and hopefully you smoke to good health, as the shaman used to tell me, make sure to think good thoughts when you smoke. But if you're using fire, you're actually using the fifth element, plasma. So you're using what's known as plasma, or electricity, or literally the same thing that's coming off the sun. So it is a solar force, fire. And again, the alchemists seem to know that. So Lawrence Principe was sorting through a collection of old chemistry books at the Chemical Heritage Foundation in Philadelphia when he stumbled upon a forgotten manuscript handwritten by Sir Isaac Newton. Now, Newton was like hardcore science, billiard ball, everything else. And in the 60s, we found out none of that was true. And as a matter of fact, he was in the employ, he was an alchemist, a very, very intense alchemist. He was related to, and I'm going to butcher this guy's name because I always do, but one of the founders of modern Freemasonry in 1770, de Goustelet, de Goustelet was his protege. He was his secretary, essentially, the right-hand man. And so Newton was fascinated by alchemy and was convinced it was real, and was actually an alchemist hunter. He hunted for the crown other alchemists. Now, it was in the guise of making sure there wasn't counterfeit, and making sure that the currency wasn't going to get tanked. But if you were hunting the secrets of alchemy, and you kind of knew, some areas where there might actually be some adepts, it definitely wouldn't hurt to break open the door and be like, hey, listen, I'll let you off with a warning, but here's where I'm stuck. Help a brother out. But he was an alchemist, and we now know this. This was discovered in the 60s. It's one of the best kept secrets in the history of science. And essentially, he was describing a recipe for the Philosopher's Stone that was turning base metals into iron and lead into gold. His belief is he found the closely guarded blueprint for the Philosopher's Stone was astonishing. However, Newton was not only intellectual heavyweight from his era trying to make gold, and it come from his older contemporary, the famed British chemist Robert Boyle. As it turns out, Boyle was a devotee of alchemy as well. And for those of you who are familiar with that name, I don't have to go further, but he was definitely part, of the Royal Society. Great science were dedicated to alchemists, and alchemy maybe needed a makeover. And that's what Lawrence Principe and this other guy decided, and they, by the name of Newman, and they decided to look at some of his works. They started looking at some of the things they were talking about within alchemy, and one of those things was something called the Tree of Diana. Now, the Tree of Diana was this tree of metal that you supposedly were able to grow that can be found in another type of experiment, one that Starkey, Boyle, and very likely Newton all conducted, and they attempted to synthesize the Philosopher's Stone. Principal, who had studied the alchemical work of these three men, came to the same conclusion as Newman and decided that he too had to replicate the long-abandoned alchemical experiments firsthand. He called the recipe from the alchemists. We now know a bit about what they were doing, and mixed the philosophical mercury with gold, sealed it in a glass egg, and watched. It had to be an egg, too, by the way. The shape was really important, and that also has to do with the way of the movement of the mercury. But interestingly enough, strange things started to happen. Inside the egg, the miniature egg began to bubble, rising like leavened dough, and then it turned pasty and liquid, and after several days of heating, transformed to what he likened to a dendritic fractal, another metallic tree, like the trees the miners saw underground, only this one was of gold and mercury. So, what's really important is the alchemists were never saying that they were creating lead from gold. What they were saying is they were accelerating the process of nature, that lead was on that periodic table of elements close to gold, and they were accelerating the process so that it was vibrating to a level where all of a sudden that would become gold. They were growing gold. They were accelerating the process of nature. The other thing that's really important about alchemy is that they were constantly studying the principles of astrology. They said that astrology was real, that the stars and the planets had vibrations, and that these vibrations would affect physical matter and their experiments. Now, a contemporary of Rudolf Steiner in the early 20s decided to do a big series of experiments to test empirically some of the claims made from the Society's astrological teachings, he was a student of both Freemasonry and Rosicrucianism, maybe some theosophy in there, but he definitely was a mystic, and he was definitely considered an adept. So Steiner had talked about that different planets, just like the alchemists talked about, same planets, ruled different metals. And so she started doing these experiments. Among these teachings was the observation of certain planets that rule certain metals. The 7 metals are gold, silver, mercury, copper, iron, tin, and lead. And they correspond to specific planets. So other metals said to have rulers including mercury for Mercury, copper for Venus, iron for Mars, tin for Jupiter, lead for Saturn. Steiner taught that the rulership is especially in effect when these elements are in a liquid solution. So to Kalisko, this teaching suggested that during certain aspects of the ruling planet, especially when it was involved in a conjunction or with an additional planet, the behavior of the metal might be altered. So to test this hypothesis, Kalisko carried out a series of experiments in which metallic salts were dissolved in the solutions and allowed to crystallize on filter paper. Kalisko hypothesized that if the position of the planets had any effect in the patterns of resultant crystals would be changed as the planet's aspect shifted. She ran hundreds of tests and reported significant results. Among the more dramatic were effects that occurred during a conjunction of the planet Saturn by the Sun and then the Moon. During the conjunction called in astrology an occultation, or a hidden, or to hide, in which Saturn was behind the Sun or Moon, the rate of crystallization was either significantly delayed or blocked altogether. These experiments were recorded and established in a series of publications released in the 30s by the Anthroposophical Society. So this specific experiment showed that lead, specifically Saturn, during the eclipse, when it was occulted by the Sun and Moon, was the growth pattern was incredibly slowed. The same process happened, though, with just a solar eclipse. You can see here the gold chloride. You see where it's dark here. The purple being the silver chloride of the moon. And then once the moon and sun had come back, you can see the gold chloride has taken over again, and there's much more activity with the gold chloride. So she was proving what has been said by alchemists and by mystics all along, in that these vibrations do have an effect on physical matter. And what's interesting is the alchemists also talked about the fact that there is correlations to plants. So a certain plant would have a correlation to a specific metal. And there is a correlation when it comes to the relation between plants and actual mineral compounds, that there's a certain high level of a certain minerals in different plants. So that's pretty interesting. Although experiments with fast-moving moon that moves through the entire zodiac every month could be regularly repeated, some of the more infrequent but longer-lasting conjunctions, such as that of Mars and Saturn, have been reported to produce some more dramatic results, sometimes lasting for several days. Thus, in 1972, Nicholas Collerstrom, who took over the experiments with Kalisko, began a set of experiments involving Mars, Saturn, and the Moon. A decade later, he was able to report marked results with solutions of iron, lead, and silver. The Mars-Saturn effect always peaked in the days immediately after the conjunction. So this work is called The Secrets of the Seven Metals. Traditionally, alchemists always viewed the seven known metals as having a connection with the heavenly spheres. Gold was associated with the sun, so on and so forth. This guy, Carl Estrom, started doing the work in the early 70s, and phenomenal book. I can't recommend it highly enough. Again, it was after I kind of uncovered that the Philosopher's Stone might be actually a real phenomenon as well, that I started looking into some of this greater work related to what the alchemists said these seven metals were. And again, we're finding correlation that there is documentation that this stuff actually exists and has an effect. So are we really hearing a planet sound? We can't hear with our ears, but the stars in the sky are performing a concert. The biggest stars make the lowest, deepest sounds like tubas or double basses. Smaller stars have high-pitched voices like celestial flutes. And planets themselves seem to have correlating notes and vibrations that are being sent out. And this is what I would say. Kepler talked about it. Pythagoras talked about it. And of course, the Egyptians talked about it as well. The music of the spheres. So this is the music of the spheres. Literally, these are the frequencies that are being emitted from these different bodies. And that seem to have, as I just showed you in the last slide, an effect on physical matter relating to that specific substance, relating to that specific metal. So, a Mormon electrical engineer based in Salt Lake City, Utah, Dr. Thomas Henry Murray, was fascinated with the idea of drawing energy from the environment. In 1911, while on a missionary work in Sweden, age 19, Murray found a source of soft, silvery white crystal, whose identity he never really fully revealed, but would change his life forever. Now, it's important to note that Sweden was one of the hearts of alchemy. There were a ton of alchemists during that time frame. There's tons of documentation showing that they had transmuted base metals into precious metals, including in the coffers of the kings and the royalty at the time. And it's interesting to note that the true alchemists or the true adepts would never tell you where they got it from or who their teacher was or anything related to that. But he made placed it inside a crystal radio set. The substance produced a signal so strong it destroyed headphones and made large speakers roar. In 1925, Murray exhibited curious engineers and energy receiving composed of a cylindrical metal tube, a grounding rod, and an aerial wire. The device could allegedly power 35 bulbs, a hand iron, and a heater simultaneously. And to show that it was generating its own energy, it was tested up on a mountain in the desert and inside a sealed container at the bottom of a lake. This guy was thorough. Although he allowed other scientists to examine his invention, Murray kept his key element, the mysterious Swedish stone, a secret. Now, it's really important to note, one of the reasons he was so thorough, and this is really sad actually, is because he could not get a patent on this. It was running cold. And they basically could not, they're like, we don't know anything that creates frictionless electricity. So therefore, this thing is not real. So we're not going to patent it. But he was getting wireless energy. It was also running, interestingly enough, on the spectrum, a blue, white, violet. So it wasn't running on the spectrum of like a yellow, red, kind of like, again, heat. It was running on the complete opposite side of the spectrum. But patent office they're like, this isn't real. And he was showing hundreds of people, doing presentations, and they wouldn't allow him to do it. And so the other thing is that during that time frame, there were some really interesting things with Edison, and the GE company would kind of kindly visit Murray's shop. And on more than one occasion, Murray's entire laboratory burnt down. And if you're a student of Tesla, then you'll understand the correlation there. But they were highly competitive, and Murray appeared to be someone that they didn't want to, kind of men in black showing up at your door. They really didn't want his inventions to come out. So Murray believed the enigmatic crystal was drawing energy from cosmic rays emitted by our sun and the surrounding stars, which he called the radiant sea of energy. He modified his invention and renamed it the Causeway receiver, which by 1929 was said to be generating enough power to run a small factory wirelessly from nothing. Exposing various materials to the output of this comparatively small ray tube, Dr. Murray found it possible to stimulate the growth of crystals and metals. The divided gold content of mining soils were actually made to grow by exposing them to specific gamma rays. This led to other more dramatic research objectives, his third revolutionary development. In 1961, Dr. Murray was describing means by which received radiant energy could be directed anywhere, as obvious reference to a new development. This would have coupled his radiant energy receiver with the ray tube applicators. His principal forte being metallurgy. Dr. Murray applied his knowledge to various related fields of study, crystallography, metallurgy, and radiant energy. Comprehending these principles very thoroughly, he was able to design crystalline and metallic composites whose response to radiant energy, whether natural or man-made, would produce specific radiant products. Whether special rays or particles, he was able to address different metals in a substance. So he was using a white stone to grow gold and silver, etc. The process we have described in reality is a growing crystal bath activated by irradiation. As the gold atom comes to being by transmutation, they become gregarious, resulting in the crystal formation. From the observable, there is every reason to suspect the low-grade ores and mine tailings provide not only seed for crystal growth, but also a nuclear environment which is well advanced or uniquely favorable for the formation of the precious metals by transmutation. So the alchemists always said that the gold, once it was taken out of its natural environment, i.e. vitriol or visit the interior of the earth, became inert. It was no longer growing. Interestingly enough, gold usually grows along with silver. It's found in silver veins. It also grows along with quartz. So there's some interesting correlation there. But he was saying that I'm just speeding up the process that's happening by nature. So give me one of your dead mines. If it's got a little bit of gold there, great, we'll grow it. And he did just that. He grew initially 18 ounces of AU per ton. The resulting yields were often as high as 100 ounces of gold and 225 ounces of silver from a little bit of clay slurry, essentially, and some specks of gold. They increased their percentages of gold between 107 and 329%. Once exposed to these electron blasts, the mildly radioactive buttons necessarily had to cool down. These buttons were then treated with gamma rays. This treatment rendered them neutral. So he could irradiate something, make it grow, and then with a different set of rays, here we have my talk, right, on solar or lunar rays, with a different set of rays, like cool it down or make it cold, and then it was inert. It was now solidified. One of the processes that we started doing in the early 50s or late 50s, early 60s was we could grow, we could get lead into gold, but it was unstable. So it wasn't worth the time to stabilize the gold. He was able to stabilize it, again, with this white stone. So this is a quote from Thomas Henry Murray. In the universe, we see the same laws being obeyed as in our laboratories. As one traces down to the almost infinitesimal constituents of the atom, one finds that matter does not exist at all as the realistic substance which we have supposed it to be. There at the very foundation, it consists of nothing more than energy charges emitted at various wavelengths or frequencies. It is becoming more and more certain that the apparent complexity of nature is due to our lack of knowledge, and as the picture unfolds, it promises a marvelous simplicity. Thomas Henry Murray. And it's important to note that this is that most amazing and handsome guy, and this is him charging a bunch of light bulbs with a box connected to nothing. So this isn't plugged in by wires, etc. This is him, historical test, literally connected to nothing. So, I can't think of a better way to end this with that quote, because that's exactly what the alchemists would say. If you have a modern alchemist, if we could take a time machine and transport modern alchemists to today, they would say almost identical what Thomas Henry Murray had said. Now, some things I left out in that process, the way he had discovered this whole process with the white stone is that he had taken this mineral from Sweden and from the the area of the Alps, etc., and had brought it back. And initially you had if you're a nerd like myself, then you'll use like crystal radio tubes and use different minerals and whatever. And he did that, and he started hearing this like crazy tidal wave almost background noise, and he was like, "What is going on? Why am I hearing this in my headphones?" And he realized, as he was pointing it to different stars and stuff, it was getting stronger. And so he started looking at the work of Nikola Tesla, who he really was, as any of us who study it are in love with. And he realized that this is what Tesla was pointing to. And by studying the work of Tesla, he started realizing, okay, this is coming from literally all stars. That it's a frequency of radiation that is being emitted from everything. And so therefore, it's not necessarily free energy. It's a radiative cosmic energy that exists at very, very, very high bandwidths that this particular white stone was transmitting and basically able to transduce down into a usable form. And then from there, he was able to, and I didn't get into all this because his story is incredible, but he was able to, heal radioactive skin lesions, cause radioactive skin lesions. He was able to use it for, like I said, growing minerals. He was able to use it for, health benefits, and had created a company for that. And of course, World War II hit, and if you ever hear my treatise on World War II, a lot of stuff got, kind of lost and swept under the rug. But he was doing a lot of stuff with his one stone and with the technology that it produced. And again, as I stated at the beginning of our talk, there were three stones. There was the vegetative, there was the mineralis, and there was the animalis. And I am convinced that the mineralis was real, and that this particular modern-day alchemist, modern-day electrician and crystallographer and mineralogist, just kind of a jack of all trades when it came to the sciences, rediscovered that white stone, rediscovered the stone of the alchemist. And that is my talk. Any questions?
When you referenced the red and white stone, is it a short answer as to what they are?
Rephrase your question, Mitch, because I'm not sure what you're asking.
What are the red and white stones? Like,
it's never talked about. It's always said that they were, interestingly enough, Thomas Henry Murray, when he found what I consider his version of it, it was a powdery substance, which is what's talked about. Even when we were in the P.D. Newman talk, he talked about it as the white thing was a powdery substance, right? I believe, because the alchemists would reference the fact that you had to go through these initiations, you had to be pure enough, you had to do all these purifications. I believe in the work that P.D. Newman has laid out, that there is, different aspects to this aspect of alchemy. And the alchemists talked about that the idea of when the teacher will appear when the student is ready. If you were not pure enough, you could not understand the concepts that you were looking at, whether it was the geometric concepts themselves, whether it was the fact that your thought affected matter. These things were for people that had that weren't profane, that weren't carnal, that were able to focus on higher centers of their consciousness.
Cool. And last question from me. When you said that there were correlations between metals and it sounded like you said plants. Did you say planets? Or
Both.
Both. Okay.
Both.
So
actually, archangels, metals, plants, and planets. And because I'm not sure if this is tiled, you and I can talk offline about something interesting in one of our degrees related to that.
Cool. Sounds good.
Cool.
I had a question.
Yeah, Ryan, what's going on, brother?
What it's kind of goes with what Mitch was saying. What is your take on the Philosopher's Stone being, how do I phrase this? Different. Wow, the word is eluding me. Basically, it's dimethyltryptamine, but different extraction methods. How they started off kind of a purple hue, and then when the extraction methods got more advanced, it became clear. Does that have any meaning as well?
Yes. So I am of the big belief that it's a weird Russian nesting doll. So, for example, the lapidum vegetalis, which is what I think we're talking about when it comes to DMT and acacia and everything else, right? Mm-hmm. I am a big believer that there were different forms of that acacia in different purities. So one form of that is a purple form, right? In more of its natural form. Another form of that is in a yellowish form, and then a pink form, and then finally kind of a white form. And those are talked about in alchemy. But interestingly enough, if you want to hide, like again, Russian nesting doll, that same process happens within the metals themselves. For example, there's the green lion that turns it into black and then white and then yellow and red and then finally back into white. Those happen within the metallurgic processes as well. So again, you could see that correlation to what I consider to be the lapidum vegetalis. 100%, it makes complete sense that you had to raise your vibration to a certain level. The other thing I would say, and this is related to the Kabbalah means mouth to ear. It means oral tradition. So when you look at the cosmology of the Kabbalah, they talk about material form starting in an archetypal or etheric level and coming down, and that's what you see. And I don't know what your experiences are, but I'll just call myself out. I've done a lot of shamanic work with shaman, and that is what you see. At one point in time, I watched a thought, like literally, I saw the thought form, and then like finally what came out, which was so much more gross, right? So much more dense than what was being thought versus what was being spoken. So I think that the alchemists were pointing to all of that. I think that there is a greater correlation to a spiritual science, if you will. And like I said, again, before I was writing my play, alchemy was a spiritual, something I practiced, but was a spiritual kind of mentality, that I had and was paying attention to. And now I have a greater appreciation, and I think it was a lot more.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
I actually did have one more. Sorry.
You're good. Please.
In one of the slides, I think I saw a hippopotamus. It looked like there was a woman on a hippopotamus. I wasn't sure if I was seeing that correctly, but that kind of stood out to me. If that is what I was seeing, do you know what that represents?
So it was, and the hippopotamus is a symbol that represents both the more aggressive nature of a person's psychology, but also dangerous. Actually, spending time in Africa, the hippopotamus is one of the most feared animals in the bush, more so than lions or elephants, because they kill more people. They're incredibly aggressive, they're very intense, and they work with the element of both water and land. So it was a direct reference to where the element goes, kind of an in-between stage between the substance being more of a liquid and a solid nature.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Anything else?
I know, man. I'm a little nervous because there's just 6 people just sitting in a room. I'm like, did I lose you guys? Warren, did you want to jump on real quick, brother?
He may still be on the call. He had to leave a second, so I was gonna.
Oh, okay. Well, then there you have it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Fair enough.
For those, I've been studying alchemy for just a little bit, and have a basic understanding. But I learned a lot during your presentation. Thank you for giving this, Warren, and we'll talk in private about some things. But
yeah, man. One thing I didn't get to really correlate too much, right? But like the idea of the ineffable light within all substance is literally laid out in like so much of their artwork. So trees will have stars within like as fruit almost, and again, you can correlate that to pick this particular tree and get the star substance that way. But also just the idea, again, Moses talked about the burning bush. But if you look at modern science, if you look at like stuff that's a little bit more on the fringe side, like Kirlian photography and those kind of things, you see a leaf that looks like it's on fire, right? And electromagnetically, we can measure that. And like I said, I'm excited to show some brothers in the Nashville Valley some really interesting things related to that and showing frequencies and things like that. You can't see that I've done to show experiments. But the burning bush literally said to Moses, I am that I am. Well, I am is I did a whole, and perhaps it'll be released at some point, but I did a whole dissertation on Somodit B, and B is another version of I am. So what he was saying is, I am pure being, and I am being pure being, right? But if you look at it from the point of view of if he's seeing this And again, there's a lot of correlation. It may be acacia. If he's seeing this acacia bush, because I never just say bush, if he's seeing this acacia bush that's on fire, well, that's what you see when you're, at higher levels, either of your consciousness or you're, having an entheogenic experience or whatever. You're seeing an energy field that very much looks like this thing is literally on fire, and yet it's not consumed by it. So I can't, in all good conscience, not see those correlations. And it was talked about in the Egyptian mystery schools, again, something that Moses was very aware of. But also think about the Ark of the Covenant, right? The Ark of the Covenant was built out of acacia wood, during that same time frame. So those things all correlate, in my opinion.
I've got another question as well now. So you mentioned the burning bush. If I can remember correctly, I think it was at Fruit of the Gods. They had a theory that it was actually Amanita muscaria that grew. I guess it has a symbiotic relationship with, I forget what type, evergreens, I believe. What's your take on that? Is that something that could be a strong theory?
So I don't know if you are familiar with any of the Egyptian motif related to like what's all over the temple walls, but Amanita muscaria is not really as prevalent as Psilocybe cubensis on their temple walls, and also blue lotus, what's called Nymphia cerulean, which is actually a blue lily. But there is now research. I'm from Oregon. And they're now doing research because it's being legalized. Well, it is legal. They're doing research related to the correlation on the DNA with aporphine and Psilocybe cubensis and blue lotus. And they seem to work like lock and key and create a very intense mystical experience that can't be denied. I've done ayahuasca ceremonies, and in that ayahuasca ceremony, there are things that I've seen that I'm like, they're like, how did I even know that or see that? You know what I mean? Or have that experience. There was one point where I was walking, we were all male and female separated. And it's called a Santo Daime. It's a ayahuasca ceremony from Brazil. And you're doing all these chants, you're moving around, and you're all in this like 6-pointed star, and you're all wearing white. It's very intense. But I didn't, I was young, and I didn't correlate the fact that the other side of the room was all female. That we had been, I was in my own world. And so all I saw was this beautiful fire next to the female side of the room. And I went to walk over to that fire and break the circle. And I kid you not, I felt this huge wave hit my chest as soon as I got up and started to move that way. And there are people that are kind of, making sure you're okay, especially for your first time. So there's a guardian who was moving towards me very frantically, like, oh God, you can't go there. And I looked at him. I didn't have to say anything. I just said, I completely understand. I am so sorry. Because there was this difference between female and male energy. And there was this whole thing we had set up. And energetically, like, I felt it, like, immediately. And I knew when he was chasing after me, that's what he was saying. Like, please sit down because you can't go over to that side. That's the female side. So there are things happening, and that's what I would say, right? And those of you guys who know me well, I would say that there are more, there are more things under heaven and earth that are in your philosophy, Horatio. Shakespeare or Francis Bacon said it best. Like, at the end of the day, we only know so much, and our measurements only measure so much, right? And so these things that are seen as pseudoscience, like astrology, now they're doing experiments with planting and moon cycles, and those seem to correlate. Like, the ancients seem to know something that we've forgotten. The fact that the different planets emit frequencies that are measurable now with certain instruments in space. That's what they were saying back in like 1200, AD. So they knew something we didn't. I truly believe that.
Can you, would you mind elaborating a little bit more on the granite in the pyramids? I found that
not
very
at all.
interesting.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So when we're looking at the Great Pyramid today, and Midge and I have a lifelong pact that someday we're gonna go there, because it's on my bucket list. It's one of the places I have yet to go. When we're looking at the Great Pyramid today, it is it's a ramshackle compared to what it was supposed to be, right? At its height, it had limestone casing stones on the outside of the Great Pyramid that were completely white. And you could see it, and again, very fertile valley, right? You could see it from miles. They talked about it. As a matter of fact, several historians, including the famous Josephus, talks about it. You could see it for miles because the sun would gleam on it, and supposedly it had a capstone that may have been gold. That's been rumored, but no one knew how to get in. And this thing was buried and buried and buried, and then it was around Napoleon's time. They were going through the sands, and again, I think he knew some things, and he was able to kind of get in. But basically, it was raided at one point in time by some tribe, Islamic tribe, and they broke open the current entrance. They broke open the stones and got to an area where they could actually get into the chamber. So they pried the stones, and most of the stones have now been used in various mosques around around Cairo, around Egypt. And so the original Great Pyramid is no longer, it doesn't exist. But when you look at the mechanical properties of these different types of granite mixed with limestone, what you get is an electrical wire. You get a conductive material, a radioactive material, and then an insulator being the limestone. And what's interesting is that the Great Pyramid, while it has no markings, so I really don't believe it is related to Khufu whatsoever, but while it has no markings, it does have huge flash burns in the ceiling and melted granite in the ceiling, and that is showing a high heat. So there are people that not only the shape of the pyramid may have some interesting correlations into physics and things like that. Again, sacred geometry is something we're just kind of learning about again. But on top of that, it appears to have been a possible one theory is almost a power plant. The other thing, I think it was multifunctional. The other thing is that the sarcophagus inside the Great Pyramid, the King's Chamber, used to be in the center of the room. And people would lay down and have experiences where they were having very intense experiences. And it's not elaborated on, but Napoleon was one of them. And according to records, this is the room where it was the last room of initiation. And this is the room where you lay down and you willfully, because you've gone through all these other initiations, again, one of them was alchemy, growing gold, all that kind of stuff. You would lay down and leave your body. You would travel in your astral body, but astral again is star, so your solar body or your soul, and you would leave through those vents, and you would go out into outer space, and you would learn basically the science of material form, and you would basically become one with the galaxy, and then in 3 days, hopefully, you would come back. 3 days of leaving your body, give some correlation here if you can catch my hints, and you would come back and you would be able to perform miracles, right? You would be able to perform these things that an adept would be able to perform because you had mastered, time and space. You had basically become one with the universe. You had found your divinity, and so what happened is that they kept having these crazy experiences that they couldn't explain. So around like 1900, 1910, the Egyptian government pushed the sarcophagus to the side. So now when you go in it, the sarcophagus is all the way on the side, but initially it was in the middle. And they stopped having those experiences. They won't even let you in that granite. They call it a coffin, or sarcophagus, but it's a granite box. But it's interesting, and the pyramid resonates. Among other things, first of all, the Great Pyramid is literally directly in the middle of the Earth, which is just crazy. I mean, we could do a whole talk on the Great Pyramid. It's astonishing, and I think that I truly believe that Nikola Tesla, when he was doing, if you're familiar with any of his work, when he was working on Wardenclyffe, because the Great Pyramid is also under a huge aquifer. I believe that he was rebuilding basically the technology that the Egyptians used, and interestingly enough, may have used. There's a theory, and it seems plausible to me, that the obelisks were transmitters of whatever that energy was that the Great Pyramid was generating. That they were collecting it and using it and that kind of thing. And there's a stela that or a hieroglyph that shows what looks like a Dendera light bulb. The Dendera temple itself, where the light bulb is shown, giant hieroglyph, is completely dark. And you can't use mirrors or any kind of thing in order. So they don't know how there's no, usually with carbon, when you're burning torches, you have some kind of ash or carbon footprint. There's nothing. So they don't know how they even were able to carve these hieroglyphs that are deep in those caverns that are completely pitch black.
That's incredible. Do you,
yeah.
Would you be interested in doing a presentation about the pyramids in the future?
Absolutely. We'd love to. I'm sure Mitch will be there.
I would love that.
Yes, I will be there.
Yeah. I would definitely love to do that. It'll be a little bit more intensive than my presentation on alchemy. This is just kind of, I'm sure if P.D. Newman was here, he'd have a million questions and corrections and that kind of thing. I told him, I'm like, please don't show up. You're going to make me nervous. Like I said, as Warren said earlier, incredible. I think his findings are incredible. I think that they correlate exactly with where alchemy was going. And I'm not saying he's missing his mark, because I'm not going to be disrespectful. I just think there may be more there. And again, the fact that this guy, went to Sweden, found a whiter stone that was a powdery white stone, and started doing things that the alchemists had talked about, and all the correlating stars, including growing gold. To me, just it correlates. And Newton and Boyle were not lightweights, and there's evidence that de Gustole hid some of what Newton had discovered. He was obsessed with King Solomon's temple, and the alchemists used to say things like a lot of the formula within alchemy is in the Bible, like the 40 days of the flood. The Noah flood was actually a huge alchemical formula. And interestingly enough, the alchemists said that you needed to find the salamander in fire. So each element had its own little creature, right? The salamander was the fire lizard. But interestingly enough, the salamander wouldn't show up until you had a perpetual fire for 40 days. So, you could say maybe this creature existed, maybe they were seeing other realms, maybe they're more sensitive. But in any correlation, if nothing else, it literally is a hieroglyph that says, keep a fire for 40 days. So I don't know if you've ever done any working with metals, but if you melt anything for more than a couple of days, you're going to get, basically like what looks like a sea of lava with a ton of metals. So there is some correlation to some interesting laboratory experimentation.
Anything else, guys? Good discussion. Good talk. Tune in, same time. This will be the third Wednesday. So the next one will be the first Wednesday in July. We'll have the Master Craftsman Study Club again at 6. Tune in. And if there will be no other questions, we'll go ahead and end it. I appreciate you guys tuning in.